Welcome back to Revision Access, and today we are looking at the Gilded Age to 1914 for women's civil rights, and that's what we're looking at today. Hopefully this will be helpful to you guys, and I know it's helpful for me, and I'm just going to talk about it on here. So, active recall, pause the video, what can you remember? If you can't remember anything, that's fine. You're going to learn a lot today. I learned a lot as well when I did this as well, so yeah. Okay, so pause the video now. Okay, moving on to what I did then. This is what I did. I knew about Temperance, the first women movement of the time period. It united women to protect their household against men, only allowing men to drink in moderation and not excessively. Obviously, I remember the women's movement in 1917, the suffragettes, gaining the right to vote and stuff like that. Westward expansion and how lots of families had to move to the plains. They got 160 acres of land. It seems like a great deal, all for free as well. You have to remember, but they're very separate from society and a lack of communication, and that's definitely a major point I'll put into the social category later on in this video. I remember the decline of births and the size of families, because there was lots more rises and opportunity for education at this point, although divorces would be also on the rise. There would be a rapid rise of women in infrastructure as an outcome of the Civil War, and obviously agriculture as well. But obviously, once Civil War ended, agriculture slowed down. But in infrastructure, they managed to stay up. Obviously, I think education and being nurses was still their major factor, definitely throughout the Civil War and to begin with in the World War One. And I also, yeah, so like I said, that agriculture fell significantly there. So that's what I can remember, and obviously that's quite a lot of stuff that I did remember. I was really happy that I remembered all this stuff, but there's a few things that are really important that I didn't remember. So this is what I missed. There was a key difference between married and unmarried women, and obviously that plays a major part. Obviously, I talked about westward expansion for married women and unmarried women in the factories and gaining educational experience. But I need to talk about how married women were still treated as home workers at this point throughout this time period, especially in 1870. That's probably when they were spoke about the most. Whereas unmarried women definitely saw much more reforms come a lot faster for them than that. And also maybe to split it off into different groups. Obviously, I just talked about married and unmarried women. Perhaps that is a little bit vague. Obviously, you had immigrant women, African American women at this time as well. Obviously, all who had different segregations and being discriminated against as well. I also forgot that after the Civil War, unmarried women, yeah, so they became costly, and then there was lots of immigrant workers. And I forgot about James Adams, who opened the Whole House in Chicago to support the settlement of newly arrived immigrant families. Now, I think she's really important. I know some people he's really important, kind of like glance over him. Now, I think that they are really, really important. I'm gonna not lie, I thought they were a girl. I'm just gonna double check what they are actually called. It's Jane Addams. Sorry, I put that wrong there. I put James Adams. Jane Addams opened the Whole House in Chicago to support the settlement of newly arrived immigrant families. So yeah, I just think that's really important. As I said the wrong thing. Obviously, prohibition. Instead of temperance, it would completely remove alcohol from society. So I think was really, really dangerous to even mention that. You think of the selling, you think of putting that anywhere in society, like, and the dependence on it, like, it's been dependent in it's definitely the UK or England, sorry, and in America when obviously all the water stuff. Obviously that's a whole different topic, but I think alcohol is definitely a part of society that you would never be able to get rid of, and prohibition perhaps is the opposite of temperance, so it's actually quite bad. I also forgot about WCTU trying to gain rights for the American woman, and I also forgot about NLC, and obviously that went to the suffragettes. I just need to know those major groups. So that's what I missed. Obviously, I think I did quite well for going back over this for not my first time, but just looking at this again. So I'm just going to tell you guys what you should know. Obviously, if you're looking to get those top grades, and I'm currently on like a B level for history, then you'd probably want to know at least all of these facts and some quotes as well. I don't have any quotes in this video, but in the comments I will put some quotes that I've picked out that I might use. They're not really like major quotes that you like put in here, but maybe find one from Jane Addams and stuff like that. So let's begin. The impact of the Civil War. Women replaced the men in agriculture at this point. They worked as nurses, and this is like sort of what people say towards this point was a trigger point in women's civil rights history. The impact of the Civil War gave them opportunities that they had never had before, just working on the factory floor if you're unmarried, even if you had a decent education, or if you are married, you would just stay at home wife. And obviously it shows that the Civil War was a success. By 1870, 13% of all unmarried women outside the home, yeah, that's how many there were, 13%, and that was rapidly expanding throughout this time period. Women made up 15% of the workforce in 1870, and that's 1.8 million people. Obviously, that is a hell of a lot of people compared to what you would think when you'd say, oh, they're just in the factory floors or they're just working at home. The Civil War was really, really like massive in terms of gaining women's civil rights, and obviously this can be argued throughout the time period. I think for this time period that we're talking about, 1870 to 1914 or 1865 to 1914, I think it's majorly important. But if you consider the whole range of stuff that we're not completely doing in this video, I think maybe it's a little bit less important. Obviously, married women were still solely the focus to work at home by the government, so obviously that is a lot less reform than what they previously had. Now, I want to highlight, like, people never talk about westward expansion and the 1862 Homestead Act when they're talking about women's civil rights, but I think it's majorly important. They're living on the plains, they get 160 acres of land, and people like mention that it's free, but I think this negatively affected women. There was a lack of education, isolated from communities and lines of communication, limited access to public service, and obviously loneliness and poverty. Like, if you have a husband who's working away in a city and you live on the plains, then that's obviously going to play a major detrimental fact. Obviously, it's going to be completely different on the plains surrounded by Native Americans who, let's face it, at the time they had every reason for being hostile to the US Americans and the white Americans. So obviously it's going to be a little bit dangerous, a little bit lonely, but you definitely should bring this up in your points when you're talking about why the Civil War perhaps wasn't as performing as that, because westward expansion really played a negative part on them. Now, obviously, when we get towards 1900, we will go from 13% of the women workforce in 1817, and they rose to 17% by 1900. They went to textiles, garments, and food processing businesses from the domestic service. They could graduate the factory floor after 1870, and they went to 3.4 million workers as secretaries or librarians from 949,000. So obviously this would then lead to immigrant workers taking their place. But just highlighting unmarried women, I think unmarried women were definitely the major group at this time, I guess you would say, because they're not really like they see the most reform before you obviously get to the NLC and all these other major groups like the suffragettes and stuff. But immigrant workers were definitely women workers were definitely the ones who were pushed down a peg, if you want to say that. They took less pay, they did have less skills because they'd just come into the country, and although Jane Addams had a whole house that I'll get to, still very, very poor, and obviously poor working conditions would always be a result of poor pay, poor wages. Now, like in 1900, I think it was a bit progressive for unmarried women, but overall not. Like, I think 13% of the women workforce to 17% is a little bit, I don't know, like you're kind of pushing that to the side. Like, I think that's a bit like, you know, you're hiding the truth there, as obviously lots of the immigrant workers are coming in for the unmarried women, and married women still aren't having a major impact on this at this time. So is it really progressive to have more women in the workforce? Yes, obviously it is. To get a larger amount of women being able to make up the workforce after the Civil War is, but I'm just saying that immigrant women working in the factory floors is not really progressive, more progressive than unmarried women graduating from the factory floors, if you know what I mean. But continuing on then, women farm workers, as I told you before, fell from 53% in 1870 to 37.5%. There was a lack of laws protecting them at this time. The size of families fell as well, from 5.42 to 3.56 in their birth rate. So that's obviously a major factor there, that there's going to be less families. And obviously, I don't think I put it in here, but the rise of divorces, 1 in 12 from 1 in 24, probably is a major fact that you guys should know. But yeah, I think it's a major hassle for them. By 1900, half of the graduates were women, though. So that does mean that their education is rising much more highly for women at this time period. So they're getting more opportunities, and that rising figure of women in the workforce and gaining secretaries, librarians, nurses, all of these major areas, it is slowly rising. And although immigrant women workers kind of brings down the standard a little bit for me, I do think that there is still a general rise in reforming it. And this is seen when we look at Jane Addams, the Whole House in Chicago, to support the settlement of the new immigrant families. Now that counters what I just said about immigrant women workers. Obviously, it's going to be hard to get good working conditions, and they're still going to have to work. But as a apportment to maybe increase their skill level will make it easier for them to demand more pay. And I think immigrant workers will be a bigger group of people to look at in the future when I do more videos on this, because obviously the suffragettes, they branched off after they gained the vote, and obviously they want to improve working conditions and all this stuff for these people. Now, probably the most important thing on here, apart from gaining the vote, is temperance. Now, we talk about the Civil War being a trigger. I think the Civil War was very, very progressive for women, and they managed to utilize their time in the sunlight, if you guys want to say that. But temperance is the first woman movement of the 20th century, and I think the first woman movement ever in the United States. It was to drink in moderation and not excessively, combat evil of the household throughout this time, and is countered by prohibition, which obviously, in my opinion, and you don't have to do this, obviously people that prohibition, get rid of alcohol, that'll help even more. No, the sale of alcohol, I think drinking in moderation is fine. I don't drink alcohol too much, but obviously I think drinking it is fine somewhat. I think you need to sell it. I think you need people to buy it. I think it supports quite a lot of the businesses and the infrastructure of the time. So I think it would be very unrealistic that alcohol would no longer operate. But I think temperance is a much better way to go. Obviously, the Women's Crusade in 1873 kind of showed this, as it were. Now, I'm just going to go back to temperance just quickly. I think it is the most impactful trigger point you have on my list here. And you definitely got to know this one. If you don't know this one and you get a question like, why is in 1865 to 1990 or wherever we end, why is temperance the most impactful movement of women throughout the 20th century or something like that, then you could say yes or you could say no, but you've got to know what temperance is, and I do think it is the most impactful movement to begin with. It's like talking about the Dawes Act from the Native Americans. It's the beginning of everything, and I think women so far have had not an easy ride of it, that's a very wrong word to use, but have had a different kind of style to it. So for example, I think African Americans and the Jim Crow laws and all of those guys, they face so much more hardship when they're trying to gain the votes and do this stuff than women did, and that's because women had supported in the Civil War. They did support in World War One. So I think they always had the potential to go further. Obviously, the government had to become much more progressive, and dealing with Native Americans and dealing with African Americans meant that obviously there was more opportunity for women to gain civil rights at the time. Now, the formation of WC2U, the largest women group in the world, protecting the home against society, counter lack of women's right, again against alcohol, but spouse abuse, and being the home protectors that married women are seen as, but being in the workplace, gaining rights and stuff like that, that is probably the most major factor here. The WC2U membership, as an example of how progressive they were, rose to 149,000 to 248,000. So obviously you don't need the exact measurements there, but obviously all the statistics. But obviously I think that this is one of the more major ones. It was attacking the alcohol abuse, spouse abuse, all going together, and using the home protector status as protecting the homes against all these things that had been allowed. So married women had an even bigger incentive to rally out and try and gain this, and this would obviously lead to the suffragettes, but it gave married women a chance to, I guess, not get away from abuse and get away from stuff, because many of them weren't abused, and many of them were to an extent, but obviously get away from just being stuck as doing this, almost being a cleaner in today's day and age, I assume, and doing stuff like that. So married women had a very big impact in the WCTU at its time. Definitely, guys, got to know that. The National Consumer League was for the rights of the women in the workplace. Now, obviously, we had seen that unmarried women with education obviously pushed women up, but they had no protection. They had no higher wages than men. They were making $7 an hour, whereas men would be making $14, even more than that. And they had no support if they were unmarried and they were mothers and stuff like that. Obviously, I'm not sure how far this goes for immigrant women workers. I will probably research that more. But for unmarried women, they needed stability. We'd already seen with agriculture that there had been a massive drop off from 50. I can't remember what it is now. It was 53% in 1870 to 37.5%. So that's definitely something to bring back up here, and I would definitely highlight this. But yeah, higher wages, protective legislation, and put pressure on the state to support mothers and children, all major stuff. And it was relatively successful to some extent, but obviously there are some things that weren't achieved. But I think more than enough, these two groups are very successful, and they obviously led to the women's vote and the suffragette movement. So triggered by the 15th Amendment, which obviously we know had a very big impact on black Americans and stuff like that. It gave all of the white men the right to vote. Now, no woman had the right to vote. Educational women who had, obviously we had seen half of all people who graduated were women at this time. So obviously that's going to result in anger from educated women who still couldn't vote. They also, to further their cause and gain more support, supported securing the vote for African Americans as well, which is great. Obviously African Americans achieved the vote as well, and they also wanted the federal constitutions to amend it locally. Now obviously that was met, and it worked very, very well. Obviously the suffragettes were formed out of this, lobbying politicians, distributing leaflets, holding marches and public meetings were major at the beginning, and with a huge focus, state level, they gained votes. They could vote in local elections, I guess you would say, in the UK, but it's not really local elections in America. It's quite big, but 20 states accepted that, gave them the right to vote in state elections, and obviously public sympathy began to rise. And I think this is where you can tell that women had it a little bit easier than African Americans and Native Americans at this time. So when you're comparing all three, I know that it's very unlikely that in a source question or in a thematic study you'll be comparing all the different sides in a 30 marker, but I still think this is majorly important to mention, and really quite interesting that they managed to gain it so quickly. They gained it before the vote in Britain, which is also really interesting, because obviously Britain, you had all of those suffragettes there, and this is where the inspiration of this came from. But it was very easy. Obviously President Wilson was a very unprogressive president, if I remember. He wasn't the one who almost started Jim Crow laws for African Americans, but he was very progressive towards women. So in 1918 they got the approval of the vote, and Congress improved it by 1919, and it was accepted by 36 states by 1920. Whilst perhaps it was not the biggest major movement in the 20th century, it was reasonably well dealt with. Now after the vote was secured, different groups began to branch off into different areas, as I have told you. So really quite interesting, and really quite successful throughout this time period. So just to conclude, you've got Temperance, you've got NOSA, you've got the WCTU, the NCL, and all of these groups all formed, and it's clearly gained a lot with Jane Addams and all of this stuff, and clearly this is some stuff that you've got to add. So from the impact of the Civil War to Temperance to all of these different reform groups, you've got to add. So I could have just left it there, but I wanted to put it into subcategories. You've got political, economic, social. Now, if you want to hit those top grades, and I myself am trying to learn how to do this, is you've got to put it into these subcategories. Now, political is just government, leaders, laws. I just use this to help me. I know it's fairly basic, but you've got to use it. Economic, you've got money, jobs, trades, all the economic stuff. And social probably is the one, I don't know if hardest on, but literally every event in history has some links to political, economic, social. But this is what you've got to do it in. You've got to pick 3 events and go 1 paragraph political, 1 paragraph economic, 1 paragraph social, and really compare them all intertwined with each other. And that is what I am trying to learn to do, and I've tried to achieve at least a B grade in history, hopefully an A, and that is what I'm going to try to achieve. Now, political, 1870, there was all married women still supposed to stay at home, so that's sort of a government legislation, obviously a de facto thing, so in fact they were meant to stay there, not necessarily meant to. Whereas unmarried women who had a high school education were able to move up, so that's political. Westward expansion, Homestead Act, obviously de jure there. You had Temperance, WCTU in the end, NCL, 15th Amendment, President Wilson, Congress, and the 36 states accepting women vote. That can all be put in political very, very easily. Now, if you're talking about temperance, political for temperance, now that's just fairly straightforward. They were political reform. They just tried to get temperance accepted, and to a varying degree between state to state. But obviously, it's fairly easy to get it in than the other ones. Obviously, you can pick any of these ones and do them by economic. By saying for political, you need to where these ones fit in the Homestead Act, different laws, different legislation, the 15th Amendment. They all fit in here. Now, economically, you've got just all the facts about jobs, really. Women replacing men in agriculture, working as nurses, 13% of all unmarried women outside the home. Women made up 15% of the workforce, 1.8 mil. 30% of women workforce went to 17% by 1900. We've talked a bit about that with immigrant women. There's more immigrant women down here. Unmarried women rising up in the workforce, and women farm workers falling down. So these are just all the statistics which show the fall in agriculture, the rise in infrastructure, and the gaining of, I guess, the rights for these women can be put economically, but I put them socially because it affects their lives. Now, socially, there was much change throughout the Civil War when women went into different lines of work, and they were quickly transferred out of them. There was westward expansion. They lived on the plains. They transferred into different jobs such as secretaries, nurses, whilst immigrant women were exploited for cheap labour. So obviously this is going to change their lives socially. Obviously immigrant women getting exploited, obviously the falling families, rising divorces, really not, you don't really need to explain much. Different reform groups establishing rights that women had never achieved before, easily put into here. And obviously the changes to the way they live throughout the westward expansion, the Homestead Act, and getting rid of the narrative of them being a home worker to being a home protector, I think is a rapid decline that you're going to see later on. But this is how I've organised that. I'm not like a key person when it comes to organising like this. I quite like doing it event by event, but obviously for the civil rights you're not meant to do that. But this is how I'm doing it here. Any comments, if anyone sees this, would be very appreciated if you guys could put in the description how you guys would do this as well. Now, what's up next? What should you do after you've got all these notes, you've got them in your head, you've got them formulated, you can talk to your parents like I'm talking to you guys right now, really. I think you've got to put all these notes down, make flashcards and regularly use them. Use them one day, another day, and then continue to update yourself on the knowledge gained from this specific category. Compare it to the post-World War I period and beyond when you get to that stage. Now, I probably have started my revision a little bit too late. I don't know when how much I've done. I've done a decent amount, but I'm going to be spending a lot of time writing flashcards, doing these videos, and going through these PowerPoints with you guys, so I can talk about it, because I'm probably going to spend lots of time talking about it. I'm not going to listen to myself talk about it, that's a bit weird, but just talking about it with someone really is probably the best way to revise for GCSE. Although I didn't have to sit them, it's the best way I revise. Just talking about it with someone is the best way you're going to remember anything. But definitely put them up to flashcards throughout this point and compare them to points through the women's civil right when you get onto the other ones, because obviously you write thematically. You write so you compare points from all across the time period, and that's what you've got to do as time. So make sure to leave any comments. Is there anything I could have done differently when preparing this? Anything that I made mistakes on, except the spelling or grammar mistakes? And I hope you like this video, revision video, mostly for me. And if you guys enjoyed this or you want to see this, I can tell you there's going to be a lot of videos coming. So I'm going to wave you guys goodbye, and thank you for listening to me talk about women's civil rights history.